All right, welcome. Today we're working with factoring trinomials. What does that mean? I like to refer to this as an unfoil. So basically what you're looking for is what were my two factors that when I foiled first, outside, inside, and last, I ended up with an x squared plus 6x plus 8. You have some students that like to use a box method that puts their x and x here and then puts their factors for 8, or for instance put their factors for 8 like 8 and 1. They like to put that there, and that's one way they do it, and they get x squared, they get the 8x, they get the x, and then they get the 8, and they see if these two numbers combine to give us a 6x. In this case, they give us a 9x. So let's make some adjustment on that and try different factor for 8. Let's try, I have x and x, and let me try a 2 and a 4, right? Which means I did x times x, x squared, 2 times x, 2x, 4 times x, 4x, and the 4 times, and don't forget you got to put some signs there, that's important too, and you end up with an 8. And this does give me that 6x that I'm looking for. So what does that mean? What did I do? Well, that means I did x plus 2 and x plus 4. And I like to show this, okay, that's my factored form. I like to show this that basically, okay, when I do go back and FOIL that, x squared plus 4x plus 2x plus the 8, I will again end up with the plus 6x plus 8. All right, so that's basically what we're dealing with when we're factoring. This is a great tool when simplifying expressions, or if we're working with polynomial word problems, polynomial division, polynomial multiplication. Now this one's a little bit different, and you could use the same box method, but I'm going to show you a different method just so you could find one that works for you. I know that my first, or my 2x squared, is going to come from, my first times my first. So I know my first is 2x times x. Now the next place I have to look is the 12. And I have to not only look at the sign for 12, which is positive, but the sign for my middle, which I like to call this, which is a negative. What does that mean? Well, here we saw that we had in this first problem, we had a positive and a positive, which means no matter what, my signs in the parentheses are going to be positive. But in this case, my sign is a positive and negative, so which means the only way I could really satisfy that or accomplish that is by having a negative, which would give me a positive for my last and an adding of 2 negatives to get my middle. So what are my factors for 12? Well, either I have negative 1 and negative 12, negative 2 and negative 6, or negative 3, negative 4. So a lot of times I like looking at it like this and say, okay, what am I going to do? Maybe I'm going to do a 2x and a 4, let's say. Let's try that out. And so I end up with negative 8x. And then let's say I try now if I use 4, and I need 3 times 4 to equal 12, then I have to use the negative 3. So I end up with negative 3x. Now, combining those together, those like terms, gives me a negative 11x. That's not what I have. I'm looking for it to be equal to a negative 7x. So let me try something different. Well, what if I tried the 2x and the negative 3 to give me a negative 6x? And what if I did the x times the, in this case, actually this should have been, if I did the x times the negative 4, this should have been a negative 4x. So even I'm recognizing that there may have been a mistake in the problem that I gave you guys, where this should have been 10x, because what I was looking for, you guys, to get a middle of 10x. And a lot of times how I make up these problems is simply by just saying, okay, 2x times x and the 4 and the 3, this is what I start with. I foil it, and I get this, and then I ask you guys to unfoil it. I think the mistake I made was I did negative 4x and negative 3x. I never multiplied it by the 2. So basically, what did I do? I did, again, when I used my yellows, I did a 2x, and this is how I write it. I did a 2x times a minus 3, and I did an x times a minus 4. You could also write it like, okay, I did x times a minus 4 and a 2x times a minus 3 and still get the same answer. Because remember, our outside and our inside, this negative 6x and this negative 4x, that's what's going to give us our middle of a negative 10x. Here's just a couple examples I could give you guys that kind of go over, they don't kind of, they do, they go over the idea of the signs and what you would need in your parentheses with signs. So I see here that I have a negative for my last, which means that in order for me to get a negative for my last, I need to do x minus a number times x plus a number. And the reason for that is that I want my last times my last to be a negative times a positive, so I'll get a negative result. And then another thing I want to look at is, okay, I want a positive in the middle, so when I multiply my x times my factors from my last, which are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4, okay, I want the bigger number to be positive, because in the end I end up with a positive value. So let me try x times a positive 12, and I'll get a 12x, and x times a negative 1, and I'll get a negative 1x, and that's where I get that positive 11x. Now let's just say I tried something different. Let's say I tried x times a 3, and let's call it, and I want the bigger number to be positive, so let's say negative 3, and x times a positive 4. I would have gotten positive 4x or a negative 3x, which would have been x. That's not what I want as far as my middle goes. So there is some trial and error, some testing, and changing your numbers. And another one you want to look at is when you end up with, let's say you end up with like a x squared minus 3x plus 18. This one's a little different, just in the fact that actually this would have been, this I would have made negative and said, okay, I know I need an x minus a number, x plus a number, because I need a negative last. And I know I want my bigger number to be negative because my middle ends up being a negative. So I have 1 and 18, 2 and 9, and I have a 3 and 6. And if I do a negative 6 and a positive 3 with my x's, I would end up with a negative 6x, and I would end up with a positive 3x, and I would get my middle of negative 3x. You may also run into some problems where you have like a 4x squared minus 8x. Let's say I gave you a 4x squared minus 2x minus 12. This becomes a little bit more challenging because my first, I now have to use a 1x and a 4x or a 2x and a 2x, right? If I use one, I have to use the other. And then my last would have been 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. I have a negative for my last here, so I know it's going to be some sort of minus plus. My middle number is negative, so I want the bigger number to be negative. Now let's just test one. Let's say I did 2 times a negative 6, I got negative 12x. And if I use 6, I would have to use 2. So 2x times a positive 4x, and that gives me a negative 8x. That's not my middle. That's not what I'm looking for. So let me try with the 4s, and let me do 4x times a negative 2, and let me get a negative 8x. And let me do x times a positive 6. And here you see I get that negative 2x, which is the middle I had. And I used a problem here which actually had 2 sets of factors for my first. I hope this helped. There's a lot of practice that goes into this, and this skill actually will lead into